Today you're going to model out force and motion of the thruster and the pod in this Google Doc instead of going to the Amplify site. So remember, claim 1, the thrusters caused the pod to move in the opposite direction. And claim 2, the thrusters only slowed the pod down and did not stop. The pod hit the space station, which made it bounce and move in the opposite direction. So remember, our goal is to model the thruster force that would cause a pod to move in the opposite direction. So in our model, your first row is used as a reference of how most ACMs are behave. And then in the second row is where you do the modeling. Okay, so let's take a look down here. So in part 1, you are going to double click here to model out claim 1. So like I said, this first row is how most ACM pods behave, where A is moving at a certain velocity towards the space station, and then the thrusters turn on and exert a certain amount of force. And in the end, the pod, or A, stops at the space station. Now, in the second row is the model that you need to represent claim 1. So this ACM pod is moving at a certain velocity towards the space station, and then you need to drag A to represent your pod, and you need to decide on what kind of force is being exerted on the pod. And then in the end, what did claim A say happened to the pod? You're going to drag another object over and decide on the velocity that happens to the pod at the end. And then afterwards, you're going to save and close and move on to number 2. Number 2, you're going to do pretty much the same, but you are going to make sure that your model represents the thrusters only slowed the pod down, and it did not stop. The pod hit the space station, which made it bounce and move in the opposite direction. Okay, so double click on it. Same is you need to move the object over here, decide on the thruster force that's being exerted onto object A, and then move object A here to represent the pod at the end and decide on what velocity change happened to the pod at the end. And once you're done, you're going to go back to Nearpod and continue on with the lesson.